There was a time when you gave them everything: your patience, your presence, your loyalty. You stood by them when it mattered, offered your time, your energy, your understanding. And what did they do with it? They took it for granted. They treated you like a constant, something guaranteed, something that would always be there, no matter how carelessly they handled it. They mistook your kindness for weakness, your silence for submission, your willingness to endure for an inability to leave. But every person has a breaking point. And when you finally walked away, when you stopped showing up, when you removed yourself from their orbit, they realized something too late. They never expected to lose you. Now, they watch from the shadows, from a distance they created. They thought you would return, that you would bend, that you would miss them enough to come crawling back. But you didn't. You disappeared from their world, left them alone with the mess they made, forced them to confront the empty space you once occupied. And suddenly, the absence they once dismissed as insignificant became a void they could not fill. They pushed you away, confident in their control, only to realize that control was never theirs to begin with. They replay the past now, picking apart moments they never paid attention to before. The way you used to wait for them to change, the patience in your voice when you tried to explain what they refused to understand, the quiet warnings in your silence before you left. They remember every time they ignored your worth, every time they dismissed your value, every opportunity they had to treat you differently. But the realization comes too late, because now you are beyond their reach, and they are left chasing shadows. The irony? They wanted power. They wanted control. They wanted to keep you beneath them, to make you doubt yourself, to ensure you never had the strength to walk away. But the second you did, you became untouchable. The second you stopped waiting, hoping, forgiving, you became something they could no longer reach. And that is what destroys them now. Not your presence, but your absence. Because while they can still whisper your name, still imagine a version of you that they control, the reality is that you are gone, and they know it. They try to replace you, try to fill the gap with distractions, with substitutes, with anything that might numb the sting of losing something they thought they would never need to fight for. But nothing works, because the problem is not the emptiness you left. It is the fact that no one else can ever be you. No matter how many people they surround themselves with, no matter how loudly they pretend they have moved on, the ghost of what they lost follows them. And no matter how hard they chase, shadows cannot be caught. The most satisfying revenge was never about hurting them, never about proving a point, never about making them suffer. It was simply this: you leaving and never looking back. You choosing yourself over the games, the manipulation, the endless cycle of being undervalued. You stepping into a version of yourself that no longer needed their validation, no longer sought their approval. And that is what destroys them. Not your anger, not your bitterness, but your indifference. Because while they scramble to undo the past, to rewrite the narrative, to make sense of the mess they created, you are already gone. They will never say it, never admit that they miss you, that they regret the choices they made, that they wish they could go back. But if you listen closely, you can hear it in their actions, in the way they try to reach you through others, in the way they still watch from the sidelines, in the way they still whisper your name when they think no one is listening. They will call it curiosity, call it coincidence, Call it anything but what it really is. The slow, suffocating realization that they lost something they will never get back. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need closure, validation, an apology. Because deep down, they already know. They know exactly what they did. They know exactly why you left. And they know, with absolute certainty, that you are never coming back. And that is what will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Familiarity breeds carelessness. People assume that what is always there will remain, that what is given freely will be given forever. They get comfortable, complacent, entitled. Your presence, your patience, your loyalty, it was expected, taken as a given, assumed to be permanent. They mistook consistency for obligation, misread your tolerance as an inability to leave. They assumed you would always be there, always within reach, always willing to endure. And so, they stopped appreciating. You felt it, didn't you? The slow erosion of effort, the way their words became dismissive, the way they stopped showing up the way they once did. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But over time, the weight of their neglect settled in. They stopped listening when you spoke. They rolled their eyes at your concerns. They took without thinking, expected without gratitude. And then one day, something in you snapped. You realized you were pouring into a void. Walking away wasn't easy. It never is. There's a part of you that hoped they would notice, hoped they would stop you, hoped they would finally see. But they didn't. Not at first, because they were still operating under an illusion that you were a constant, an unshakable force that would always be within reach. They let you go without understanding what they were losing. But now they understand. Now they feel the absence, the quiet void you left behind. They reach for the version of you they took for granted, only to find that you are no longer there. It hits them in unexpected ways. The silence where your voice used to be. The moments when they need you, and you are gone. The realization comes slow, but when it lands, it is devastating. They try to rationalize it at first. They tell themselves you'll come back, that you just need time, that this is temporary. They replay the past, searching for the moment when they lost you, trying to pinpoint when things changed. But by the time they truly comprehend it, it is too late. You are no longer accessible. That is the irony of human nature. People only assign value to what is scarce. As long as something is available, it is assumed to have no cost. But the moment it is removed, the moment it becomes unreachable, that is when the hunger sets in. That is when regret begins to gnaw. And that is when they begin to chase what they once discarded so carelessly. But you are no longer in reach. You are no longer waiting, no longer offering yourself to be overlooked. The version of you that tolerated neglect no longer exists. The human mind is a strange thing. It craves what it cannot have, obsesses over what is just out of reach, assigns value not based on merit, but on scarcity. When something is abundant, it is taken for granted. When something is scarce, it is treasured. And the moment you became distant, the moment you removed yourself from their grasp, something shifted. They began to want what they once dismissed. It wasn't always this way. At first, you were there, readily available, always answering, always showing up. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if they called, you would respond. If they needed, you would give. And because of that certainty, they did not cherish it. They assumed it was endless, inexhaustible, guaranteed. But nothing is infinite. Not patience, not presence, not love. The moment you stepped away, something clicked. The absence you left behind was not just an empty space. It was a reminder of everything they had and did not appreciate. Suddenly, the certainty they relied on was gone. Suddenly, you were not predictable, not accessible, not within reach. And that scarcity? It amplified their desire. They did not expect to miss you. They did not expect to feel the weight of your absence. But as time stretched on, as the distance between you widened, something began to gnaw at them. They started to wonder, where did you go? Why aren't you answering? Who are you becoming without them? The less they knew, the more they wanted to know. They tell themselves it's curiosity, that they just want to check in, that they just want closure. But it is more than that. It is the slow, suffocating realization that what was once abundant is now scarce. And scarcity creates obsession. The very thing they neglected has now become the thing they chase. The human brain despises loose ends. It is wired for completion, for resolution, for the satisfaction of a closed chapter. And when a story is left unfinished, when an expectation is shattered, when an outcome does not go the way it was assumed to go, the mind fixates. It replays. It analyzes. It obsesses. This is why they cannot stop thinking about you. They believed they knew how your story would end. They believed you would always be there, always waiting, always returning. When they pushed you away, they assumed the door would remain open, assumed you would linger, assumed that they could circle back whenever it suited them. But then you did something they never expected. You left. And now, their mind is trapped in an unfinished narrative. They were supposed to be the one in control, the one dictating the terms, the one who decided when and how the connection faded. But your exit was not on their timeline, not on their terms. It was abrupt, final, unresolved. And that unresolved nature, that is what consumes them. And so, they reach out. They test the waters, send messages laced with nostalgia, try to gauge whether there is still an open door. They do not want reconciliation. They want resolution. They want to feel that they were the ones who closed the chapter, that it was their decision, that they were not left behind. But the story is no longer theirs to finish. You hold the pen now, and you have written them out of the plot. The irony is that had they valued you when you were present, they would not be haunted. Now, had they treated you with care, with appreciation, with the recognition you deserved, they would not be suffering under the weight of an unfinished ending. But they didn't. They assumed they had time. They assumed they had control. And now, they are trapped in the past while you move forward unburdened. They are not chasing you. They are chasing a memory, an illusion, a carefully curated version of you that only exists in their mind. The person they dismissed, neglected, overlooked, that is not who they want back. What they truly want, the version of you they now realize they needed. It is not about regret. It is not about love. It is about control, about rewriting the past, about convincing themselves that they did not make a mistake. When they see you thriving, when they see you moving forward without them, their mind revolts. How could someone they once dismissed now be out of reach? How could the person they thought they controlled no longer belong to them? So they begin to mirror. They reflect back the version of you that they think you want, the person they assume will lure you back. They say the things you once longed to hear, make the promises they once refused to make. It is not real. It is a performance, an attempt to reconstruct the connection, to regain control over what they lost. They made you question yourself, made you believe that you were too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. They convinced you that their neglect was your fault, that their indifference was a response to something you did, that their distance was a reflection of your flaws. But it was never about you. It was always about them. They were blind, not because they could not see, but because they refused to. Because seeing would have meant acknowledging, and acknowledging would have meant changing. And change, that was something they were never willing to do. It was easier to blame you, easier to downplay your worth, easier to make you feel like the problem, instead of admitting that they were incapable of valuing something rare. Now, they know. Now, they feel it. The absence they dismissed has become a weight they cannot shake. The loss they assumed they could recover from has become an ache that lingers. And the person they once pushed away, that person has become untouchable. People assume what is always there will remain. They mistake reliability for permanence, mistaking consistency for obligation. You were available, you gave without hesitation, you listened without judgment. And for that, you were treated as an afterthought. They did not question whether you would show up, whether you would forgive, whether you would stay. It was never a matter of appreciation, only expectation. But people only see the value of water when the well runs dry. And by the time they realize they are thirsty, you are already gone. They dismissed your worth in the comfort of assumption. They convinced themselves that you would never walk away, that their presence alone was enough to keep you tethered. They tested your patience, disrespected your loyalty, pushed you to the edge, and laughed at the idea that you would ever leave. But every person has a breaking point. Every heart has a threshold where tolerance turns into exhaustion, where kindness hardens into silence. And once that moment arrives, there is no turning back. At first, they barely noticed. They assumed the distance was temporary, that your absence was a phase. They told themselves you would return, that you just needed time to cool off. But time did not cool you. It clarified you. You began to understand that being unappreciated was not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their blindness. And the longer they went without you, the more the weight of their mistake began to settle. The absence that once seemed insignificant became a wound, a realization, a consequence they never anticipated. Now the silence is deafening. The conversations that once annoyed them are now missed. The presence they once dismissed now lingers like a ghost in their memory. They replay the moments they ignored, the times they overlooked you, the chances they had to show gratitude but chose neglect instead. Regret creeps in like a slow poison, whispering reminders of what they let slip through their fingers. They reach for you in their mind, but all they find is the void they created. Desperation sets in. They try to regain access, to undo the past, to bring you back into the role they assumed you would always play. But the version of you who tolerated neglect no longer exists. The door they once left cracked open is now locked, the key long discarded. They begin to realize something brutal. People do not walk away without reason, and those who leave without looking back have already suffered enough trying to stay. Regret is an unforgiving teacher. It does not offer second chances, does not grant rewrites, does not allow for shortcuts. It forces people to confront their mistakes in the coldest way possible, by making them watch from a distance as someone they once took for granted thrives without them. And the worst part? They can never reach you again. They can only watch. The irony is cruel. They once saw you as disposable, interchangeable, replaceable. But now, you are the one thing they cannot have. They scroll through memories, reread old conversations, try to reconstruct the past in their heads. But memory is not reality, and nostalgia does not rewrite mistakes. They are left with nothing but longing for something they once had, but never truly valued. They remember you as someone they could manipulate, as someone they could rely on to always return, to always listen, to always be available. They took comfort in the predictability of your patience, in the certainty of your loyalty. And now that those things are gone, they do not recognize you. The detachment, the silence, the indifference, this version of you terrifies them. So what do? They mirror. They reflect back the traits they believe will lure you back in. They mimic your language, your emotions, your desires, pretending to be someone they never were. It is not growth. It is a performance. At first, it may seem convincing. The sudden apologies, the unexpected self-awareness, the promises of change. They tell you what you always wanted to hear. They acknowledge the pain they once dismissed. They craft messages laced with nostalgia, with longing, with an undertone of regret. But something feels off, doesn't it? It is not real. It is rehearsed, calculated, an attempt to reconstruct the connection on their terms. They do not see you as you are now. They only see what they want you to be. They made you believe it was you, that your standards were too high, that your emotions were too much, that your needs were unreasonable. They convinced you that their neglect was a response to your flaws, that their indifference was somehow your fault. But it was never about you. It was always about them. They did not mistreat you because you were too difficult to love. They mistreated you because they lacked the ability to value something rare. It was never about your intensity, your passion, your depth. It was about their inability to rise to meet it. They blamed you because taking responsibility would have meant admitting they were the ones who failed. So, they projected. They gaslit. They minimized your worth until you began to question it yourself. And the more you tried to prove yourself, the more they withdrew. Not because you were wrong, but because they could not handle someone who forced them to confront their own shortcomings. You were a mirror, a reflection of what they lacked. And instead of rising to meet you, they chose to break the mirror, because that was easier than facing what they truly were. Now, they see. Now, they realize what they had, what they ignored, what they lost. They replay the past in their minds, dissecting the moments they brushed off, the warnings they ignored, the love they mistook for weakness. They remember how you were always there, always trying, always believing in them. And they realize you were never the problem. Their blindness was. They wish they could go back. They wish they could undo their mistakes. But the thing about realization, it always comes too late. By the time they understand what they lost, you have already evolved into someone new, someone stronger, someone who no longer seeks their approval, who no longer questions their own worth, who no longer needs them to see. And that is what haunts them. Not just your absence, but the fact that you no longer need their validation. They crave what they once dismissed. They long for the attention they once resented. They want to be seen by the very person they once ignored. But it is too late. Because now, their vision is clear, but you are already gone. Let them regret. Let them wonder. Let them suffer under the weight of their own blindness. Because the price of not recognizing something valuable is losing it forever. And the pain of knowing that is something they will carry for the rest of their lives.